Welcome to the Washington Monthly Show. I'm Paul Glastris, editor-in-chief of Washington Monthly Magazine, and I'm here with my co-host Ed Kilgore, chief blogger of the Washington Monthly Magazine. Ed, I hope you're well.
I'm fine.
This is our back-to-school show, Ed. We've got K through 12 and college students going back to school. We also have the latest issue of the Washington Monthly, our annual college guide, that's hitting the newsstands, and our rankings where we show alternative rankings to U.S. News and World Report. It's our biggest issue of the year. We'll talk a little bit about that with the editor of that issue, Kevin Carey of New America, a good friend of the magazine. But before we talk about that and about where the candidates are on education issues, which is kind of interesting, I wanted to suggest that in a back-to-school show that maybe the silly season, as they call it in politics, of August is about to end. We've had a crazy month of August with the focus on Donald Trump and building walls in Mexico and now apparently other parts of the continent, and Joe Biden getting in the race and all kinds of bizarre speculation. Let me suggest, Ed, that the silly season's about to end. We've got a serious September coming up. We've got President Obama visiting Alaska to try to focus national attention on climate change, a serious issue. We've got Congress having to pass a budget by the end of September, which will presumably focus political minds on serious things. We've got the Pope visiting, who's going to talk about inequality and justice issues. What else we've got? We've got
Iran nuclear deal.
The Iran nuclear deal. Instead of just bloviating, people are going to have to vote. So maybe the political season's going to get serious, and we're going to move away from Donald Trump and all of this and get down to something serious. So that's my question to you. Is the silly season over or not?
Well, it's not so clear. I think the kernel of truth is that the rise of Donald Trump, in some respects, has been the function of just kind of massive and unique media coverage of every word that comes out of his mouth. He's going to have to share attention with real-life events for a change, so that's true. On the other hand, when you look at the Republican race, at least, what's likely to happen in this serious September? Probably additional evidence that the Republican congressional leadership cannot deliver on its promises to a very angry and frustrated conservative base. They're not going to stop the Iran nuclear deal. They're not going to defund Planned Parenthood. They're not going to, repeal Obamacare. They're not going to do any of the things that, the failure of which to do is apparently fed all this anger and all this support for outsider presidential candidates. So, on the one hand, there will be a very different feel to media coverage of politics and government in this month. But in the end, I think the biggest beneficiary of the switch from August to September may very well be Ted Cruz, the more conventional candidate in the Republican field, who will be right at the center of all these fights in Washington and who will be constantly, on almost an hourly basis, shrieking that the Republican base needs new Republican leadership to actually accomplish anything. Which could be a very compelling message in this kind of environment.
And Ted Cruz also has decided to team up with Donald Trump. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, they're doing a joint event in Washington on the Iran nuclear deal, where they'll apparently sort of high-five each other and take the same obvious position. What's interesting to me is that one of the major co-sponsors of this event is I believe it's called the American Security Project, headed up by a dude named Frank Gaffney, who is mainly famous as perhaps the most distinguished Islamophobe, in public discourse in America. He's the guy that's he and his organization are constantly warning about the threat of Sharia law, taking over the United States. He's a very extremist figure, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, I've had the pleasure of debating Gaffney on various news programs, and
yeah, he's out there.
he can be. He's the kind of person that media outlets bring on to get the extreme belligerent militaristic view that they can't quite get all the time, or at least until recently,
Yeah.
from sort of more mainstream candidates, mainstream spokesmen.
Yeah, so I've never heard of anything quite like this. I'm not quite sure what Donald Trump is getting out of this alliance with Ted Cruz. It's very obvious what Ted Cruz is getting. But this could be kind of a scene stealer, a scene stealer, even in an environment that's focused on what is happening and what's not happening in Congress. So don't underestimate Donald Trump's ability to grab headlines, even if, ostensibly the camera is pointed in a very different direction.
Well, maybe Ted Cruz is running for vice president in a Trump administration.
Well, he's pretty young.
Because they have Marco Rubio is the obvious sort of vice presidential material.
Yeah.
Mature beyond his years and of Hispanic origin and so forth.
Yeah.
Ted Cruz, from a more conservative, far right.
That's the same characteristics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So speaking of vice presidents, Ed, we've endured, I would say, a month of speculation of Vice President Biden getting in the race. It's almost as if the entire press corps has been begging him to get in the race for a variety of reasons. Plenty of voices pointing out what little space there is for Joe Biden as someone who's not terribly distinguishable from Hillary Clinton and, years behind or certainly a year behind in preparing such a race. You wrote a story in the Talking Points memo, essentially asking for the madness to stop. What's your case?
Yes. Well, like you, I've been amazed at this obsession with Biden over the past 2 or 3 weeks, based on what is apparently very slim evidence that he's interested in running. The bad faith in this whole, will Biden run coverage has been pretty obvious all along. You have Republicans who will support any phenomenon that appears to detract from the strength of Hillary Clinton. You've got Biden's own friends or his son's friends, late son's friends running around promoting this. And then you just have the usual horse race mania of political reporters. And in all this, there's not really much attention to whether the man really wants to run or not, and whether there's any remote chance he would succeed. As you noted earlier, there's not a big substantive case for Joe Biden as against Hillary Clinton. You'll notice all these polls that everybody's so obsessed with. Hillary is still running 3 and 4 to 1 over Biden everywhere, except maybe Delaware. And, it seems to me that the kernel of truth in the draft Biden talk is that were something terrible to happen to Hillary Clinton, something really toxic coming out on this email, quote unquote, scandal, the Democratic Party would have some tough decisions to make. And a lot of people are not very confident in sending a, 75-year-old socialist into the fray in a general election. But, you can understand how Biden might be sort of a plan B, an obvious unifying figure for a party that's lost its putative nominee. But none of that's actually happened.
Right.
And there are a few months to go, before the convention. This panic over Hillary Clinton is extremely premature. The last head-to-head national poll I saw still showed her beating every single Republican candidate in a general election trial heat. A lot of this is just manufactured by people that don't like Hillary, people that are Republicans, and horse race journalists who just need some new excitement.
Yeah.
So I just don't buy it.
Yeah, so in terms of silly season, will any of this sort of speculation subside? Will one reads the Hillary team understands the quavering knees of a lot of Democratic activists and hardcore supporters, and is out trying to make her case that the email scandal is overblown. She's got this. Talking, for instance, about their success at recruiting about half the superdelegates that are out there. The superdelegates being the 10% of delegates who don't necessarily have to follow voters. So do you see her solidifying her position in the next month, or does the steady drip, drip, drip of the email gate continue to eat away at this?
Well, some of the panic or, alleged panic is attributable to some very selective polls, particularly those conducted by Quinnipiac in some battleground states, showing her just plunging, against Republican candidates. I think right now she needs probably four things to steady the ship. One is a little more data about where her standing actually is, which I think will show that she's in much better shape than a lot of these people talking about the collapse of Democratic confidence in Hillary Clinton. I think she needs to get the focus away from Iowa and New Hampshire, which are probably Bernie Sanders' two best states in the country, and back onto the national scene. She needs to keep piling up these party endorsements, as she already is, to make it clear that the establishment is not shopping around for a new candidate. And again, she needs to project a consistent, confident message of her own focused on issues. And once and for all, say whatever she's going to say about the damn emails. I think if she does those four things, she should be in pretty good shape.
Well, in the spirit of moving into out of silly season, we're going to talk education here. A real issue that is sort of a sleeper one in this campaign, especially higher education, which hasn't really been a major issue in any campaign that I can remember since 1992. But it is now, and we're going to have that discussion with our friend Kevin Carey. Kevin is the guest editor of the Washington Monthly. He's heads the education program at New America, and is the author of a terrific book called The End of Education, the End of College, rather. You ought to go out and buy it, and you ought to go out and buy my book, also the Other College Guide, which is also on sale. You can see both at the WashingtonMonthly.com, WashingtonMonthly.com, rather. You can also see our annual college rankings, which are an alternative to U.S. News and World Report. We've been doing them for about a decade. We also have our best bang for the buck rankings, which are an attempt to give some evidence, some data for non-wealthy students on which colleges are the best value for them. Kind of a unique thing out there in the market. And Kevin's been involved in all of it. Kevin Carey, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Now, this is a kind of a curious election, curious campaign in my mind. And let me just offer an observation, which I think I got from you. I read so much and so much of your stuff that I just absorb other people's brilliance. But here's the observation, and that is, on the Democratic side, we have virtually all of the candidates talking in some detail, in fact, quite specific detail, about how they would reform the higher education sector. But almost nothing coming out of these campaigns on what to do about reforming K through 12 education, which has been an abiding issue in every major campaign going back, a couple of decades. On the Republican side, it's almost the opposite. You had an entire debate or program in New Hampshire last week or the week before, where Campbell Brown, the host, former CNN correspondent, had a whole bunch of candidates talking, Republican candidates talking K through 12 reform. Almost all the candidates, as part of their stump speech, are out there bad-mouthing, trying to either destroy or scale back the Common Core education standards. And yet almost nothing from any of these candidates, with perhaps one exception, about reforming higher education. Is that a fair observation, Kevin?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's been interesting to see the contrast to prior elections where I think higher education has never been much of an issue, mostly because for a long, long time, there really hasn't been much political salience to it. Everyone thought our higher education system was fine, other than if we could just maybe find a way to help people pay for it somewhat. But I think clearly, particularly on the Democratic side, all of the candidates see mounting public anxiety around student loans, college debt, and the broader cost of higher education as being a very potent political issue and something that their constituencies will respond to and that they feel obligated to kind of have a position on. So there's been sort of a one-upsmanship where first, Bernie Sanders and Martin O'Malley came out with plans with phrases like free college or debt-free college, and then Hillary Clinton, in I think a pretty characteristic Hillary Clinton way, waited a while and came out with her own plan, which was very ambitious. I think $350 billion over 10 years, and very comprehensive, very much representing, I think, the kind of state of conventional wisdom among Washington, D.C. policy people, both actually not only on the left but also on the right. Looking both at it incorporates a lot of Elizabeth Warren's ideas about reducing student loan interest rates. It is consistent with more or less everything the Obama administration has been doing around for-profit colleges and new ways to pay back student loans, but also kind of nods toward the idea that we, at the same time that we make existing colleges more affordable, we also need to have more innovation in the higher education sector, which, to the extent that there's any kind of discernible higher education agenda coming from the Republican side, that's where it is, and it's mostly coming, I think, from Marco Rubio. There was a good piece in Vox.com that my friend Libby Nelson wrote a couple of days ago, talking about sort of Marco Rubio's particular history in higher education and how he seems to be, in some ways, fairly authentically committed to a set of ideas where we would open up the higher education sector to new models that might be innovative and lower cost and more effective. And, that would be the way to kind of get at this cost issue.
Well, let me ask you a question, Kevin. Why have Democrats, I think the answer is obvious, but I'll just ask it anyway. Why are Democrats so interested in higher education as an issue and Republicans not so much, with the exception of Marco Rubio?
Well, I think it's an easy one for Democrats. There's I think a very strong correspondence between middle class voters who have families and probably, I assume, are active politically and tend to go to the ballot box, and people who are scared to death about how much money it's going to cost them to send their kids to college. And that fear is not a partisan fear. It doesn't matter where you're registered. Anyone who wants to send their kids to college, which is most people, unless you're really, really rich, it's a big, big issue. It's a huge pocketbook issue. It hits people right in the middle of their lives, kind of uncomfortably close to retirement, but not far enough to where you can really have saved up all this money. And it's become a major issue also, I think, for younger voters who, the Democratic Party has been successful, I think, in bringing younger people into the fold over the last 10 years. And in a lot of ways, this idea of being overburdened by debt seems to be a pretty key part of millennial self-identity. It's just one of the things that puts these people together, this sense that they've kind of gotten screwed over by the higher education system, and debt is a big part of that. And so this is a way for Democrats to speak to them.
Could I ask a more purely political question, Kevin? There are some candidates in both parties that are sort of taking the conventional partisan approach to problems in the public sector. Democrats kind of throwing money at the problem, at least in terms of making student loans more affordable, or perhaps finding ways to provide stronger support for higher education institutions, at least in the public sector, and Republicans actually wanting to address the problem by cutting the funding. There are two Republican candidates, in particular, Scott Walker and Bobby Jindal, that have rather conspicuously gone after higher education in their own states, starving the beast, so to speak. What's your sense of, is there a rank and file constituency out there for just treating, higher education institutions just like they're these terrible K through 12 teachers unions, just to be demonized and starved of funds?
I doubt it. I mean, I wonder about that, and I think I wonder if that's not the kind of thing that plays a little better within a state than nationally. I mean, absolutely Scott Walker has gone after the University of Wisconsin, but I think that kind of comes under the category of all those liberals in Madison. That's where that's where all the unions rallied, and that's where a lot of the iconography was of his kind of epic fights against the public sector unions that have become a big part of his kind of reason for being. And I think the university this idea of the university is kind of a hotbed of liberalism has been part of that. But most people don't send their kids to flagship universities, and I think I question whether on a national level you're going to have the same sort of resonance. I don't quite see it the same way.
Yeah, I'm guessing the silence of most of these candidates on these issues it speaks more loudly than any particular thing any of them say, which I read as millennials aren't our voters. At least they're not our voters right now. We're trying to win base Republicans, and there are not too many 22-year-old base Republicans. There are a lot more 68-year-old base Republicans. Now, let's look at the flip side, and that is K through 12 education. Isn't there going to be some legislation reauthorizing the landmark Maine federal program for our primary and secondary schools, the ESEA? Isn't that sort of teed up in Congress, Kevin, or am I wrong?
It is teed up in Congress. Both the House and the Senate have passed new versions of ESEA, which is probably better known as the No Child Left Behind Act. So the last time, this is the bill that was originally passed in the 1960s. Congress reauthorizes it every 7 or so years, or it's supposed to. The last time they did it, however, was 14 years ago, in 2000, 2001, at the beginning of the George W. Bush administration. Has become very controversial, disliked by many people. So both the Senate and the House have passed new versions. They are now going to Congress committee. It'll be an interesting question as to whether they can work something out. They passed a bipartisan bill in the Senate, but a purely partisan bill in the House. And so it's unclear whether Senate Democrats will go along with something that would also appeal to the farther to the right people in the House, and those people kind of held up the whole process, and the bill barely got out of the House until concessions were made to them, and by making those concessions, they took all the Democratic support away from the House bill. So to get this through, people are going to have to tack far enough right to get it through the House, unless they think there's some Hastert rule solution, although I don't know why.
The Hastert rule being let sort of Democrats vote in the House.
Yeah, the Hastert rule being the only way like democracy works in America right now, which is you pass a bill through the House. That doesn't have the support of you let the Democrats and some Republicans pass a bill through the House.
Right.
Which is precisely the sort of behavior that is feeding a lot of this anger in the Republican base, I might add.
Right. Yes.
Every time Democrats, every time John Boehner, discards the Hastert rule and lets Democrats must pass legislation, that's adds to this pretty well documented fury among the base, right?
Right. And so, if they could do that, which would get the Democrats on board, and presumably that would be enough to get President Obama to sign the bill, although he hasn't issued a specific veto threat on it yet, or not. And so the president's intentions in this are kind of a big wild card, and he is kind of keeping his cards pretty close to the desk. There's a lot of speculation among people who do my kind of job about, what his bottom line is and where he would draw the line in terms of vetoing a bill or not vetoing a bill. I think there's a fair amount of appetite in the administration to sign something, add it to the list of accomplishments. And also, I think, one could argue that there is a fairly strong strategic interest for Hillary Clinton in signing the bill and thus basically taking K-12 education off the table as an issue. I think K-12 issues and teachers union issues are always tricky for Democrats because, on the one hand, the teachers unions are a major political and financial part of the Democratic Party's power base. On the other hand, they're also a way for Democrats to probably fairly be criticized as beholden to certain kinds of traditional labor-based special interests. If they pass this big piece of legislation, then none of the candidates have to really answer any questions about this big piece of legislation. They can say, well, we're going to see how it plays out and we'll implement it when the time comes. And so I've certainly heard some people say that one reason the president might sign something is to basically help Hillary out in the election.
So can you give us just a 30-second summation of the high points of this of the two bills, the one that's the bipartisan in the Senate and the more Republican-supported House bill, and what the issues are between them?
Well, both of the bills roll back the federal government's role in K-12 education, which was expanded pretty dramatically in 2001 by No Child Left Behind. Probably the most important thing they do is No Child Left Behind created a mandatory process for states and school districts to identify and try to remediate low-performing schools. It allowed states states have their own discretion in terms of setting academic standards, and that's of course how the Common Core has come about. Why the Common Core was able to come about without any federal legislation, because the Common Core isn't in fact a federal program. It's just something that the states got together and decided to do. So states get to set their own standards. They get to pick their own tests. But once they administer the test, they have to use a federal formula for interpreting those test score results and identifying low-performing schools. And then once the schools are identified as low-performing, they have to kind of follow federal procedures in terms of picking among a bunch of choices in terms of what to do about them. Now, I would argue, and actually did argue a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times, that a lot of this anxiety around federal interference in schools is very overblown. Actually, over the whole 14-year history of No Child Left Behind, very, very few schools have actually been seriously, say, shut down or reformed under No Child Left Behind. States have mostly managed to use their discretion to avoid all of that. But nonetheless, there seems to be a strong something like a consensus in Congress that we ought to reduce the federal government's authority over this. The main argument is basically eliminate it entirely or mostly reduce it. So the Senate compromise is to mostly reduce it, but still leave some federal role in place. The House wants to just get rid of it entirely and basically go back to the way things were before 2001, where the states got to do whatever they wanted.
Well, it doesn't sound like I'd agree with either, but that we have to deal with what we have. And so I guess I interpret all this as being education having perhaps yet another sleeper role to play in this campaign. I can imagine the vote, however it goes, being one that forces a lot of Republicans to take a position on a major piece of legislation that they so far haven't. And as you said, it may, if it passes, take the issue off the table for Democrats, but I can imagine a whole lot of Republicans, if it passes in some kind of bipartisan form, feeling that they need to be against it.
Yeah, and in particular when you have the sort of the Common Core and the insanity around the Common Core thrown into the mix. And you're right that to the extent that K-12 has played any significant role in either in the presidential primaries at all, it seems to be around the Common Core and, Jeb Bush sort of taking this lonely stance of being the last guy who won't totally sell his principles out and contradict what he said before about the Common Core, which, good on him from my perspective. I just don't think he's been doing it for so long, it seems like it would be hard for him to just say, fine, I give in, it's terrible. Maybe he could, I don't know. I'm not an expert on these kind of things.
Kevin, if I could follow up a little bit, I think the submerged split in the Republican Party on education policy isn't so much over Common Core or things like that. It's really, or even the federal role in education, it's those conservatives who, frankly, have sort of given up on public education altogether. They would like to use public funds to promote private education or even homeschooling. And so what I wanted to ask you, and those who are still, like most rank and file voters, still committed to having a public education system at both the higher and K through 12 levels. But what I want to ask you about was this. The analog to the teachers unions role in the Democratic Party over on the Republican side is sort of this coalition of private school operators, homeschoolers, and at the higher education level, private for-profit colleges, which frankly the Obama administration has all but declared war on. Are you seeing any signs that any of these groups are all together or playing a role on the Republican side this year?
I think the homeschoolers definitely, and this is actually partly a function of technology. With the creation of the internet, it's a lot easier to homeschool your kid plausibly than it used to be, and a lot of people are doing it. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, and I think your kind of diagnosis is correct, and it's worth. We go all the way back to the first President Bush, who kind of saw himself as the education president and was actually very much a supporter of kind of the moderate, on some level, pro-government approach towards standard setting and so forth in education. Bill Clinton very much was seen as this was one of his signature, come to the center ideas, where he was in favor of charter schools and in favor of standards and those kind of things. I have no idea what Bob Dole's K-12 education agenda was. George W. Bush was, obviously a huge force behind No Child Left Behind, and it very much reflected how he ran for president, and it was one of his signature achievements. And so all that really marginalized the hard pro-free market forces on the right. They hated, the libertarians hated No Child Left Behind. The Heritage Foundation hated No Child Left Behind, but they were pushed to the side because of George W. Bush. I don't know what John McCain's K-12 policies were. I'm sure he didn't really have one. And then you actually saw in the last campaign, Mitt Romney sort of revived the idea of school vouchers, for lack of anything better, I think. But that was, something that he kind of put out there. And you could see the voucher people who've been kind of hanging around for 20 years, saw that, I think, as an opening to come in and revive their ideas. And so we're kind of getting back to that now, where you hear people talking more about local control and, perhaps people's memories of what states' rights and local control around education used to mean in this country have faded somewhat, given how long it's been. I think that kind of lacking in the other idea is it's perfectly natural for a Republican candidate to talk about states' rights, local control, getting the federal government out of your schools. I'm not sure what the downside is of talking that way.
And what is the downside for Democrats of talking about K-12? What explains their kind of reluctance to make this an issue or to put forth views, fresh ideas, positions on this?
Well, partly because, again, the teachers' unions are mostly against education reform. They hate charter schools. They hate vouchers. They don't really like standards and accountability. And they've been a force, particularly in some states, in pushing back on the Common Core, primarily because the Common Core has been tied to the tests associated with the Common Core have been tied to new systems of evaluating teachers
right,
using those test scores.
Right. So is it that people like Hillary Clinton just don't want to have to re-engage in this sort of internal war within the Democratic Party? Because it's just kind of astonishing to me that an issue that really was central to Bill Clinton's presidency and his campaigns is just really not on. No one's really talking on the Democratic side about positive reforms to public education.
I think there's a kind of sort of an ideas exhaustion point we're getting to too, where there don't seem to be any new ways of understanding or thinking about K through 12 education that are exciting people, that are getting kind of energizing them around new possibilities and new prospects for reform. And so I think, lacking that, I think sort of, again, the order in which all the higher education proposals have come out and the kind of conspicuous silence around K-12 issues on the Democratic side is pretty telling.
Well, what I'd love to have a Democrat do is...
Didn't Randy, hasn't the American Federation for Teachers already endorsed Hillary?
I mean, I don't know that that's true, but the American Federation of Teachers...
Pretty sure Randy Weingarten did.
Yeah. I mean, and so again, this is a long-standing relationship that goes back a long way. During 8 years ago, during the primary, Hillary was, I think, certainly understood to be more pro-union than Barack Obama. That was one of the ways that one could find sort of some distance between them. And I remember in sort of January and February, kind of at the height of that whole contest between the two of them, she definitely took more of an anti-school reform, pro-union stance coming into some of those primaries that Obama did. And that was kind of the last we've heard from her because, she went to be Secretary of State and stuff, so that's fair. But
what I would love to hear the Democrats come out and say is a sort of more of like a steady as you go position. We've had now 20, 30 years of a standards-based movement with increasing high-stakes tests and the creation of charter schools and charter management organizations. And during that period of time, we've seen the dropout rate in the United States finally begin to fall and fall quite substantially. Mm-hmm. And you've had, a doubling, if not more, of test score achievement among Hispanic and African Americans at the 3rd and 8th grade level. I mean, we've had actual progress. Nobody knows this, but except education wonks, but it's generally true. And no one really kind of gets out there and said, we've been trying to reform our schools for 30 years. It's kind of sort of working. Let's keep at that. But I feel like I'm a lonely voice in that position.
I think part of this too is that you have, if you think about your college educated blue state parents, particularly women, they don't really like standardized tests that much. If you're fairly well off, you're above the median in terms of income, and you're setting your sights on college. I think you picked up a fair amount of cultural antagonism to standardized tests. You sort of see it as a critique maybe of the suburban school district that you paid a lot of money to get your kids into. You're more worried about, how you're paying for college, not so much, you sort of see the growth of the test opt-out movement, which I think is becoming a serious thing in New York State. That's not a movement that's being led by Hispanic and African-American parents. That's the kind of thing that, like Brooklyn Yuppies sign on to.
Right.
And Brooklyn Yuppies are Hillary Clinton supporters.
Well, I would add, too, that the experience of the last few years is sort of, reignited the legitimacy of complaining that there's not enough money being spent on public higher education because of all the pretty massive reduction in state support for state universities. I know out here in California we've got standards out the wazoo, but the real problem is quite a few years of underinvestment in public education. So you don't sound like just some shill for unions or higher ed lobbies when you say that we maybe need a little more money in the system, not simply and that's true also of K through 12 in a lot of states recently. So maybe we're at a brief window here where there's actually a little more justification for saying that either instead of or in addition to all these structural reforms, we just need more money.
Well, Kevin and I
think that's right.
We actually deal with this in the current issue of the Washington Monthly. As we begin to wind up our show here, we can kind of bring it full circle and talk about really what the Democrats' plans are to do exactly what Ed is saying, which is craft policies that get state governments to reverse the quite dramatic cutting of higher education budgets that we've seen in the last sort of 5, 6, 7 years. Tell us about what's in the magazine that kind of gives you the deeper dive on that.
Yeah, there's a great article by my colleague Alexander Holt in the article. It's a profile of the president of Louisiana State University, a man who's been battling Bobby Jindal this year over exactly this issue. His name is F. King Alexander. He's a fascinating character. He's a college president, but also kind of a radical, which college presidents don't tend to be, who has some really interesting ideas about, in his mind, the idea that we basically lost our way all the way back in 1972 when the federal government, instead of supporting public universities directly, decided to create a voucher system. And it's interesting that even as vouchers remain a very political issue in K-12 and essentially are a bright line ideological test for a lot of people on the left and the right, we've had a voucher system in higher education for 40-some years now. You can take your federal Pell Grant money or your federally subsidized loan and give it to any institution, private, nonprofit, public, or for-profit. Basically, no questions asked. F. King Alexander, President Alexander, thinks this is a terrible mistake. He thinks it's one of the main reasons that, as Ed said, states have been disinvesting in higher education. And that it's time to put a stop to that. And you really do see seeds of those ideas appearing in the Democratic platform. So we talked earlier about how Hillary Clinton wants to reduce student loan interest rates. That's right. But she very much also wants to, and this is true for Bernie Sanders as well, she wants to strike a new kind of bargain with the states where in exchange for more federal money, they would be obligated to reverse course and bring some of this money back into their public university systems. And, I think personally, I think this is the kind of proposal that might be less vulnerable to charges that, Democrats just want to throw money at the problem, because this isn't about some expansion of government that's never occurred before. This isn't somebody saying, well, let's just do it the way they do it in Norway. This is about the restoration of something that we had for a long time in this country. It's bringing us back to a place that most people feel pretty good about, which is a place where if you work hard, you could go to a good public university and not walk out of college saddled with lots and lots of student loans. That's basically the deal that, that built the lives that a lot of the people who now have kids in college enjoyed. They remembered, I think. And I think the idea that it's not available to their kids, and certainly to their kids, seems unfair. So that's, I think there's always kind of a fairly high threshold for people really to kind of be able to put themselves out there and say, let's spend a lot more federal money, because as Ed said, it does open you up to that, those high spending Democrats critique. But for various reasons, all the candidates seem to have gone past that. They're all out there on this idea.
I tell you what, this time of year, I'm always acutely aware of the contrast between all these conservative state governments in the South that seem to be starving higher education, public higher education, and the rabid region-wide intense interest in college football for those same public universities.
Yeah, right.
So, I think you're right. I think there could be a backlash, and it's interesting that this is beginning with the president of a state university in a very conservative state of Louisiana.
Well, I'll just say.
Initially, too, what we found in what Alexander found in reporting the story is that, F. King Alexander really puts it on New England. He basically says that, the whole reason we have this voucher system is so a bunch of hoity-toity, elitist private schools in New England could take a bunch of money that they didn't deserve. That sounds like a pretty good.
And that's historically accurate. Even back in the period between World War II and the 60s, when the South's per capita income was about 50% of the nation, the South had higher per capita expenditures on public higher education than the rest of the country. It's an intensely personal issue in the South, so I think that is a fascinating subtext here.
And I'll point out that some of the best scoring schools on the Washington Monthly rankings are Southern schools. Texas A&M, Georgia State, and so forth. The North Carolina system, Chapel Hill, as well as some of the others. So,
I'll hold up my coffee cup here.
There you go. Is a bulldog there?
Yeah.
So this I think has the possibility, if done right, in a maybe a different era with a different Republican Party, of being a bipartisan position. The idea that states can play Washington taxpayers for a sucker by cutting their budgets for their own universities and having the federal government fill up the coffers by increasing Pell spending or subsidized loan spending, sounds like a scam to, I think, most people. And every other form of federal aid that you can think of for highways, for Medicaid, for any K through 12 education, the federal government doesn't cut a deal that says we'll give states a set amount of money, and they're free to cut the money they were putting into those programs. Every one of those other programs requires the states to belly up to the bar and put some money on the table, a set amount of money, if they want the federal dollars. I don't see, getting back to Kevin's point of this being more of a restoration than an expansion of government. This is simply having federal higher education spending be like every other kind of spending. So I think
it certainly, if Republicans nationally and regionally have their way, Medicaid will stop being that kind of program pretty soon.
Well, that's true. As I said, it has to be maybe a different Republican Party. So we've got education as we've described, kind of the sleeper issue going into the fall. We'll see if our predictions are right. I want to leave it there, and we'll pick it up next week. Ed Kilgore, a blogger for the Washington Monthly. Kevin Carey, guest editor of the Washington Monthly College Guide and New America Scholar. Thank you for joining us this time, Kevin.
Thank you.
And we'll see you all next week. Take care.